The tattered jacket and weathered face of the elderly man who stepped into the diner seemed to offend her very existence. "We don't serve your kind here," she sneered, pointing to the "no loitering" sign, while customers watched in uncomfortable silence, nobody willing to challenge the manager's authority. The veteran simply nodded, his calloused fingers absently touching something metallic that hung from a worn chain around his neck, a gesture so subtle most wouldn't notice. But her eyes caught the glint of gold and silver beneath his collar. What she didn't know was that in exactly 17 minutes, the sound of military helicopters would shake the very foundation of the building, and everyone inside would learn exactly who they had turned away. What was the mysterious object hanging around the old man's neck that would change everything? Type respect and subscribe to our channel to discover the shocking truth about the forgotten hero who walked among them. Sarah Miller had worked at Nellie's Diner for just over 3 months, long enough to know when to stay quiet around Ms. Nellie Patterson herself. The 50-something owner had a reputation that stretched across Millfield, fair with those she respected, ice-cold to those she didn't. Sarah watched the confrontation unfold from behind the counter, her hands gripping a pot of fresh coffee so tightly her knuckles turned white. The old man's back was straight as he turned to leave, no complaint, passing his lips despite the public humiliation. There was something in his eyes, not anger or shame, but a deep, quiet dignity that made Sarah's chest tighten. Her father had that same look sometimes, especially when he spoke of his time in Desert Storm. "What are you staring at, Sarah?" "Table." "7 needs a refill," Nellie barked, smoothing down her crisp apron as if removing invisible contamination after the encounter. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied automatically, but her eyes followed the veteran as he settled himself on the bench outside the diner, just beyond the property line. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as the town of Millfield began its day. Through the window, Sarah could see the old man sitting perfectly still, gazing down the road as if waiting for something or someone. His isolation struck her as profoundly wrong. During her break, Sarah slipped out the back door with a paper cup of coffee and a wrapped muffin she'd paid for herself. She hesitated at the corner of the building, watching the veteran for a moment. His silver hair caught the sunlight, and for an instant he looked like a photograph from another era. "My dad was in the Gulf," she said, approaching slowly and extending the coffee. "He always said a hot cup fixes most troubles, at least temporarily." The veteran looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered features. Up close, Sarah could see he wasn't as old as he'd first appeared. Perhaps late 60s, his face aged more by experience than years. "That's kind of you, miss," he said, his voice a low rumble as he accepted the coffee. "But I don't want to cause you any trouble." "It's my break, and what I do with it is my business," Sarah replied with more confidence than she felt. "I'm Sarah." "John," he offered simply, taking a careful sip. "Thank you, Sarah." She noticed how clean his hands were despite his worn clothes, and how he sat, with perfect posture, even on the uncomfortable bench. When the sleeve of his jacket shifted, she glimpsed a forearm, marked with an old scar, long and deliberate, the kind that told stories. "That woman doesn't speak for all of us," Sarah said, nodding toward the diner. "My father taught me better." John smiled faintly. "Your father sounds like a good man." "He was," Sarah said, the familiar ache returning. "Passed 3 years ago." "Cancer?" John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'm sorry to hear that." A silent moment passed between them, the kind of quiet recognition that exists between those who understand loss. Sarah's gaze dropped to the thin chain disappearing beneath John's collar. Something about the way he occasionally touched it, as if drawing strength from whatever hung there, made her curious. "Will you be in town long?" she asked. "Just passing through," John replied, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "Been a long time since I was in Millfield." Sarah wanted to ask more, about the chain, about why he'd come back, but her break was nearly over, and Nellie would be looking for her. "I should get back," she said reluctantly. John nodded, raising his cup slightly. "Thank you for this, and for the company." As Sarah turned to leave, a black SUV with government plates drove slowly past the diner, the driver's eyes lingering on John. He didn't seem surprised or concerned, merely took another sip of coffee and continued his patient vigil, walking back. To the diner, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that John wasn't just some random drifter. There was purpose in his presence, and something important hidden beneath his humble exterior. She resolved to learn more when her shift ended, unaware that by then everything in Millfield would have changed. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about John as she mechanically refilled coffee cups and took orders. When Nellie disappeared into her office to handle the day's accounts, Sarah slipped outside again, finding John exactly where she'd left him. "Still here?" she asked, though she was glad to see him. John looked up with a small smile. "It's a good spot to watch the world go by." Sarah sat beside him, conscious of Nellie potentially seeing them through the window. "You said you've been to Millfield before?" "Long time ago," John replied, his eyes scanning the modest main street with its hardware store, post office, and single-screen movie theater. "Changed some. Not as much as you might expect." "Were you stationed at Fort Garrison?" Sarah asked, referring to the now-abandoned military base 20 miles outside town. John's expression shifted slightly, a shadow crossing his features. For a time, his fingers moved unconsciously to the chain around his neck, and Sarah's curiosity intensified. Whatever hung there seemed to anchor him somehow. "My dad was there too before they closed it in '97, she ventured. "Sergeant Thomas Miller." For the first time, genuine surprise registered on John's face. "Tom Miller? He was your father?" Sarah felt a sudden tightness in her chest. "You knew him?" John nodded slowly. "We served together briefly. He was a good man, solid under pressure." He paused, studying her face. "You have his eyes." Tears threatened, unexpected and unwelcome. Sarah rarely encountered people who'd known her father in his military days. He didn't talk much about his service. "Most don't," John said simply. A comfortable silence fell between them. Sarah noticed how John tracked every person who walked, by every car that drove past, not anxiously, but with the awareness of someone accustomed to observing details. "That thing you're wearing," Sarah finally asked, gesturing toward his neck, "is it from your service days?" John's hand stilled against his chest. For a moment she thought he might not answer, or perhaps be offended by her directness. "A reminder," he finally said, "of promises made." Sarah wanted to ask more, but John gently changed the subject. "How long have you worked for Ms. Patterson?" "Just a few months. It's not great, but jobs are scarce here since the factory closed." She shrugged. "Trying to save enough to go back to school." "What would you study?" "Nursing," Sarah answered without hesitation. "Dad always said I had healing hands." John nodded approvingly. "The world needs more healers." A black pickup truck drove by slowly, the driver making no pretense of not staring at John. Sarah noticed John's almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "Friend of yours?" she asked. "Not exactly," John replied, "but we have mutual acquaintances." The cryptic answer only heightened Sarah's curiosity. John clearly wasn't just a random homeless veteran passing through. There was purpose in his presence, and now connections beginning to emerge. "Nellie's not a bad person," Sarah found herself saying, feeling oddly defensive of her difficult employer. "She's just set in her ways. Lost her husband a few years back, never quite recovered." "Loss shapes us all differently," John said, wisdom in his tone. "Some turn inward, build walls, others reach outward." The diner door slammed open, and Nellie appeared, hands on her hips. "Sarah! Break time's been over for 10 minutes. Sarah jumped to her feet. "I'm sorry, I lost track of time." "And I'm losing customers waiting for service," Nellie snapped, her gaze shifting to John with undisguised disdain. "I thought I made myself clear earlier." Before Sarah could respond, John stood with quiet dignity. "The young lady was kind enough to share her break time with me. Any fault is mine, not hers." Something in his tone, respectful but unflinching, momentarily silenced Nellie. She looked between them, then focused on Sarah. Tables need clearing, now. As Sarah hurried inside, she glanced back to see John walking slowly toward the town square, his posture straight and unhurried. The chain around his neck caught the sunlight for an instant, and she thought she glimpsed something gold and circular. 3 more vehicles had appeared at the far end of Main Street, a black SUV and 2 olive-drab Humvees, moving deliberately toward the town center where John was headed. Whatever was about to happen, Sarah suddenly realized, had been set in motion long before this morning. Millfield had once been a thriving community, its economy bolstered by the nearby military base and the Reynolds manufacturing plant that produced vehicle parts for the defense industry. Both had closed within a year of each other in the late Talutsat 1990s, leaving the town struggling to redefine itself. Many families moved away, seeking opportunities elsewhere, but some, like Nellie Patterson, remained, clinging to what they had built. Nellie's Diner had been Patterson's family restaurant. When her husband Robert was alive, they'd opened it together the year after they married, transforming an old hardware store into the heart of Millfield's social scene. Robert had been the gregarious host, while Nellie managed the books and perfected the recipes that made them famous county-wide. When Robert died unexpectedly of a heart attack 7 years ago, something in Nellie hardened. She shortened the menu, reduced the hours, and renamed the place. The warm family atmosphere gave way to efficient service and strict rules. She still made the best apple pie in 3 counties, but now it came with a side of judgment. "He's gone, Sarah. You can stop staring at the door," Nellie said sharply as she rang up a customer's bill. "Sorry, Ms. Patterson," Sarah replied, wiping down a recently vacated table. "I've worked too hard to keep this place respectable," Nellie continued, as if justifying her actions to herself as much as to Sarah. "Start letting in every vagrant, and soon we'll be nothing but a soup kitchen." The lunch crowd had begun to filter in, mostly local shop owners and the remaining factory workers from the smaller plants that had survived the economic downturn. Mayor Wilson occupied his usual corner booth, holding informal office hours over BLTs and coffee with concerned citizens. "Did you see those military vehicles?" asked Carl from the hardware store as he settled at the counter. "Haven't seen those around here since Fort Garrison closed." "Probably just passing through," replied Frank the postmaster. "Nothing in Millfield. Would interest the military now." Sarah's ears perked up at this, but she kept her head down, clearing dishes while staying within earshot. "Strange timing, what with that veteran showing up this morning," Carl continued, unaware of the earlier incident. "My nephew's stationed at Fort Lewis. Says they've been doing some kind of special ceremony tour honoring Vietnam vets or something." Nellie slapped menus down in front of them with more force than necessary. "Coffee?" Her tone effectively ended the conversation, but Sarah's mind was racing. She glanced out the window toward the town square where she could just make out John sitting on a bench near the modest Veterans Memorial, a simple stone obelisk listing the names of Millfield's fallen from various conflicts. The town had once been proudly patriotic, with parades on Veterans Day and Memorial Day that brought the community together. After the base closed, those traditions faded, along with the direct connection to military service. The younger generation, facing economic uncertainty, left for college or jobs elsewhere, rarely returning. "Order up for table 4, called Hank, the short-order cook who'd worked at the diner since Robert's days. Sarah collected the plates, her movements automatic as her thoughts remained with John and the mysterious military vehicles. The mayor had noticed them too, she observed, as he peered out the window between conversations with constituents. Outside, more vehicles had parked along Main Street, not just military, but several black SUVs with government plates. Men in suits mingled with uniformed personnel, all seemingly congregating toward the town square. "What's happening out there?" asked a customer, drawing others to the windows. "Probably some government waste of taxpayer money," grumbled another, Nellie, frowned at the gathering crowd blocking her entrance. "Sarah, tell them to either come in and order or move along. They're scaring away customers." Before Sarah could respond, the mayor stood up, tossing bills on his table. "Something's happening at the memorial," he announced, heading for the door. Several customers followed, curiosity overcoming their hunger. "This is ridiculous," Nellie muttered, but even she moved to the window, watching as a small crowd began to form in the square. From her vantage point, Sarah could see John still sitting on the bench, now surrounded by men in uniform. Rather than looking intimidated, he seemed to be expecting them. One officer, a tall man with silver hair and a chest full of ribbons, approached John and did something Sarah couldn't quite believe. He saluted and held it. The diner emptied as customers streamed out toward the growing commotion. Sarah made to follow, but Nellie's voice stopped her. "Where do you think you're going? We still have customers." Sarah turned, seeing only two elderly women, still seated, more interested in their pie than the gathering outside. "Ms. Patterson," Sarah said carefully, "I think something important is happening. Something to do with that man you turned away." 2 hours earlier, before John had even entered the diner, Sarah had been restocking napkin dispensers when her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Check local news." Something about Dad's old unit. Sarah had quickly ducked into the restroom to search online, finding only a brief mention of a special military recognition ceremony scheduled somewhere in the county. No specific details were provided. Unusual for such events, which typically sought public attendance. When the elderly veteran had walked in and been so cruelly dismissed, Sarah hadn't immediately made the connection. It was only during their conversation, when he mentioned knowing her father, that pieces began falling into place. Now, as the commotion outside grew, Sarah slipped into the kitchen, pulling her phone from her pocket. "Mom, it's me," she whispered when her mother answered. "That ceremony today, I think it's happening here in Millfield. There's a veteran who knew Dad." "John Mercer?" her mother asked, her voice suddenly alert. Sarah's heart skipped. "He only told me his first name. How did you—" "I got a call yesterday from an Army liaison officer," her mother explained. "Asked if we'd be attending the ceremony. I told them I didn't know anything about it." "Mom, what's going on? Who is this guy?" There was a pause on the line. "Your father served with him in Operation Just Cause in Panama, then again in Desert Storm. They were close. After your father left the service, they lost touch." Another pause. "He was awarded the Medal of Honor, Sarah. It wasn't publicized at the time, classified operation. They're doing some kind of formal recognition now." Sarah felt her knees weaken. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration, awarded for acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty. And she'd brought him coffee in a paper cup. "He's here, Mom, in the town square. There are military vehicles everywhere. I'm on my way," her mother replied, urgency in her voice. "Don't let him leave." Sarah ended the call just as Nellie pushed through the swinging kitchen door. "Everyone's abandoning their food to gawk at whatever circus is happening outside," she complained. "What's wrong with people?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Ms. Patterson, that man you turned away this morning is a Medal of Honor recipient. He served with my father." Nellie's expression flickered between disbelief and dismissal. "Don't be ridiculous. If he was some kind of war hero, he wouldn't look like a homeless person." "Not all heroes wear their medals on the outside," Sarah replied, surprising herself with her boldness. Nellie's face hardened. "I don't appreciate your tone, young lady. I have standards for my establishment, and I don't regret maintaining them." Outside, the sound of a helicopter grew louder, drowning further conversation. Both women moved to the window as a military chopper appeared over the tree line, hovering before setting down in the high school football field a block away. "What in the world?" Nellie murmured, her certainty visibly wavering. Sarah untied her apron. "I'm going out there." "You walk out that door, you're fired," Nellie snapped automatically. Sarah paused, then continued removing her apron. "My father gave 20 years of his life to this country. The least I can do is show respect to his brother-in-arms." She walked out, leaving Nellie staring after her. The town square had transformed in minutes. Military police had cordoned off a perimeter, and a small stage was being rapidly assembled near the Veterans Memorial. Official-looking vehicles lined both sides of Main Street, and uniformed personnel moved with practiced efficiency. At the center of it all, still seated on his bench, was John. He looked exactly as he had earlier, same worn jacket, same quiet dignity, yet somehow different as the context around him shifted. The crowd that gathered at the edges of the security perimeter whispered and pointed, trying to understand what was happening. Sarah approached a young MP at the barricade. "Excuse me, I need to get through. I know him, John Mercer." The soldier looked skeptical. "Ma'am, this is a secured area for the ceremony." "My father was Sergeant Thomas Miller," Sarah pressed. "They served together. My mother's on her way." "Please." At the mention of her father's name, the soldier's expression changed. He spoke quietly into his radio, waited for a response, then lifted the barricade tape. "Follow me, ma'am." As they approached, Sarah saw John in conversation with several high-ranking officers. When he noticed her, a warm smile broke across his weathered face. "Sarah," he said, rising to greet her, "I was hoping you'd come." "You could have mentioned the Medal of Honor when I brought you coffee," she said, half joking to mask her awe. John shrugged slightly. Didn't seem relevant to the conversation. One of the officers, a general by his insignia, raised an eyebrow. "You've met Ms. Miller already?" "She showed kindness to a stranger," John replied simply, "like her father would have done." The general nodded respectfully to Sarah. "Your father was an exceptional soldier. He would be proud to see you here today." In the distance, Sarah spotted her mother's car pulling into a makeshift parking area, where an officer immediately directed her to a reserved space. Throughout the square, final preparations were underway for whatever ceremony was about to unfold. "John," Sarah said quietly, "what exactly is happening here?" He touched the chain around his neck, and for the first time withdrew what hung from it, a gold star suspended from a blue ribbon set in a protective case. "The Medal of Honor. After all these years," he said softly, "they're finally telling the full story." Panama, 1989, Operation Just Cause. Captain John Mercer led his special operations team through the dense jungle, moving silently despite the oppressive heat and humidity. Intelligence had confirmed that a high-value target, a known drug trafficker, with ties to the Noriega regime, was hiding in a compound 3 kilometers ahead. "Radio check," John whispered. "Miller here," came the immediate response from his second-in-command, Sergeant Thomas Miller. "Area secure." The mission was classified, known only to a handful of senior officers. Their objective: capture the target alive for interrogation about weapons shipments to guerrilla forces destabilizing neighboring countries. What intelligence hadn't told them was that the compound would be heavily guarded by mercenaries with Soviet-supplied weapons. The first burst of gunfire came without warning. Miller took a hit in the shoulder but kept firing, covering the team's movement to better positions. John dragged a wounded comrade behind a concrete wall, bullets splintering the vegetation around them. 9 o'clock, Miller shouted, spotting a machine gun nest. John neutralized the threat with a well-placed grenade, but more hostiles emerged from hidden bunkers. They were outnumbered 3-1, with 2 men injured and ammunition running low. Then John saw it, a young boy, no more than 10, being used as a human shield by the drug trafficker as he attempted to escape to a waiting. "Helicopter, boss has a kid," John called to Miller. Without hesitation, John broke cover, running directly into the line of fire. Miller provided covering fire, taking down 2 guards as John closed the distance. The trafficker raised his weapon, aiming not at John, but at Miller. John launched himself forward, tackling both the trafficker and the child to the ground as bullets tore through the space where they had stood. The child scrambled away to safety, but the trafficker pulled a grenade, removing the pin. In a split-second decision, John covered the grenade with his body, shielding both Miller and the child. But the grenade was a dud, a defective Soviet copy that failed to detonate. Taking advantage of the confusion, Miller secured the trafficker, while John recovered the failed explosive. The mission was a success, but the details remained classified for national security reasons. John received the Medal of Honor in a private ceremony at the Pentagon, with only a few witnesses present. The citation mentioned extraordinary heroism, but omitted specifics. 6 months later, John and Miller were deployed to the Persian Gulf, present-day Millfield Town Square. "Your father saved my life that day," John told Sarah, his voice bringing her back from his recounting of events, "and many times after." Around them, the ceremony preparations continued. A Marine Corps band had assembled, and several rows of chairs were now arranged facing the small stage. Official-looking photographers tested angles and lighting. "Dad never mentioned any of this," Sarah said, stunned by the revelation. "He couldn't. The operation remained classified until recently." John looked past her, his expression softening. "There she is." Sarah turned to see her mother being escorted through security. Catherine Miller had aged gracefully, her brown hair now streaked with silver, but she carried herself with the same strength Sarah had always admired. When she saw John, her pace quickened. "John Mercer," she said, emotion breaking through her. Composed exterior. After all these years, John stood respectfully. "Catherine, you look well." "You look exactly the same," she replied with a small smile, though all three knew it wasn't true. The years had marked John deeply, carving lines of experience into his face. They embraced briefly, the gesture conveying decades of shared history. "Tom would be so proud to see this day," Catherine said, stepping back to study the man who had served alongside her husband. "He should be standing here, not me," John replied quietly. Catherine shook her head. "Don't. He wouldn't want that." Sarah watched their interaction, seeing layers of unspoken understanding pass between them. "Mom, did you know about the Medal of Honor?" "Yes," Catherine admitted. "Your father was one of the few witnesses at the ceremony. He couldn't tell anyone, not even me, until years later, and only because John had given him permission." A senior officer approached their small group. "Colonel Mercer, we're ready to begin in 15 minutes. The Secretary of the Army has just arrived." John nodded, though Sarah noticed him flinch slightly at the use of his rank. Colonel, not just a sergeant or a captain, but a full colonel. "I'll be right there," he assured the officer, who withdrew respectfully. "Colonel?" Sarah questioned. "Retired," John clarified. "A lifetime ago." From the edge of the square, Sarah noticed Nellie Patterson watching the proceedings, her expression unreadable from this distance. Several other diner customers had gathered as well, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by confused curiosity. The crowd had grown substantially, with locals calling friends and family as word spread about the key unusual event unfolding in their small town. Police had closed off Main Street to accommodate the overflow. "They're declassifying the full mission details today," John explained, part of a congressional mandate to recognize covert actions from that era. "Several operations are being acknowledged simultaneously across the country." "Why here?" Sarah asked. "Why Millfield?" John's eyes met Catherine's briefly before he answered. "I requested it. This was Tom's hometown, and there's something else he would have wanted acknowledged." Before he could elaborate, a helicopter appeared overhead, momentarily drowning out all conversation. As it descended toward the football field, John straightened his posture, the military bearing becoming more pronounced. "It's time," he said simply, reaching again for the medal around his neck. The military convoy that had been gradually assembling in Millfield was unlike anything the town had seen since Fort Garrison's closing ceremony decades earlier. 4 Humvees formed a perimeter around the square, while uniformed personnel from every branch of service moved with coordinated precision, transforming the sleepy town center into a venue worthy of national attention. Mayor Wilson, initially flustered by the sudden military presence, now stood proudly near the stage, having hastily donned a suit jacket over his casual Friday attire. Local police, initially confused about their role, had been seamlessly integrated into the security plan by the military professionals. "Is that the Secretary of the Army?" whispered one onlooker, as a distinguished man in a dark suit emerged from a black Suburban flanked by aides and security personnel. Indeed it was. Secretary James Harrington moved directly to the small gathering where John stood with Sarah and Catherine, extending his hand with genuine respect. "Colonel Mercer," he said warmly, "thank you for finally allowing us to do this properly." John shook his hand with a slight nod. "Sir, and you must be Mrs. Miller," the secretary continued, turning to Catherine. "Your husband's service is also being honored today. His actions were no less heroic." Catherine straightened, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary." As they spoke, a Marine Corps colonel approached, leaning in to whisper something to Secretary Harrington, who nodded in understanding. "They're ready for us," he informed John. "The President sends his personal regrets that he couldn't attend. He'll be calling you this evening." Sarah's eyes widened at the mention of the President. The scale of this event, in tiny Millfield of all places, was beginning to sink in. A young Army lieutenant approached, addressing John formally. "Colonel Mercer, sir, if you'll follow me to the staging area." John turned to Sarah and Catherine. "They've reserved front row seats for you both." As he walked away with the lieutenant, Sarah noticed how different he looked now, his posture impeccable, his bearing unmistakably military despite his civilian clothes. The transformation from the seemingly homeless veteran Nellie had rejected to this respected officer was striking. "Mom," Sarah whispered as they were led to their seats, "did you know this was going to be so big?" Catherine shook her head slightly. "John always avoided publicity. The fact that he's allowing this at all is surprising." The seats filled quickly as locals and hastily summoned media took their places. A buzz of excitement and confusion rippled through the crowd as the Marine Band began playing soft ceremonial music. From her seat, Sarah could see Nellie Patterson, hovering at the edge of the gathering, indecision written across her face. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah saw something unexpected in her employer's expression, not just embarrassment, but a deeper disquiet. A senior officer approached the podium, calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for our presentation of colors and our national anthem." As the flags were marched in with solemn precision, Sarah noticed tears streaming down her mother's cheeks. Catherine rarely showed emotion when it came to her late husband's military service, having long ago developed the stoic resilience common to military spouses. Following the anthem, Secretary Harrington took the podium. "We gather today to write a historical oversight to publicly recognize acts of extraordinary heroism that, until now, remained classified for national security reasons." A murmur went through the crowd as they began to understand the significance of what was unfolding. Operation Just Cause and the subsequent actions during Operation Desert Storm included missions so sensitive that the full extent of our service members' heroism could not be acknowledged. The Secretary continued. "Today, that changes." Behind the stage, John stood, waiting, dressed now in a suit that an aide had brought for him, his own, Sarah realized, not a borrowed one. This had been planned meticulously, his earlier appearance in worn clothing a deliberate choice rather than necessity. "It is my profound honor to present to you Colonel John Mercer, United States Army, retired," the Secretary announced. John walked onto the stage with measured steps, the crowd rising in spontaneous respect. Under the bright sunlight, with his silver hair and erect posture, he looked every inch the distinguished officer, far from the man who had been judged and dismissed hours earlier. Secretary Harrington continued, "Colonel Mercer's actions during a classified operation in Panama in 1989 demonstrated valor far beyond the call of duty when his team came under heavy enemy fire." As the Secretary recounted the events Sarah had already heard from John, she watched the faces in the crowd transform from curiosity to awe. The townspeople of Millfield were beginning to realize that a genuine hero had walked among them unrecognized. Near the back, Sarah spotted Carl from the hardware store, his expression stunned as he connected the rejected diner patron with the decorated officer now standing at attention on stage. Next to him, the postmaster Frank removed his cap in belated respect. A uniformed officer stepped forward bearing a velvet-lined case containing a Medal of Honor, not the one John had carried, around his neck, but a new presentation intended for public display. Though Colonel Mercer received this medal in a private ceremony decades ago, today we reaffirm the nation's highest recognition for his valor, the secretary declared, lifting the medal for all to see. The crowd rose again in thunderous applause, many wiping away tears as the magnitude of John's heroism became clear. In that moment, the small town of Millfield became the epicenter of a national moment of recognition, all because a humble hero had chosen their forgotten community for his long overdue public honor. A hush fell over the crowd as John stepped forward to the microphone. Despite the grandeur of the ceremony, his words were simple and direct. "This honor has always belonged to my team," he began, his voice steady, "especially to those who didn't come home." In the front row, Catherine nodded slightly, understanding the weight behind his words. "I stand here today representing men and women whose actions will never be fully known," John continued. "They served without expectation of recognition or glory. They simply did what was necessary." He paused, scanning the crowd before his gaze settled on Sarah and Catherine. One such man was Sergeant Thomas Miller, a son of Millfield. "Tom saved my life more times than I can count." His courage under fire was matched only by his integrity in all things. Sarah felt her mother's hand tighten around hers as John spoke of her father. "Tom couldn't be with us today, but his spirit embodies everything this medal represents." John touched the medal at his neck, the original, not the ceremonial one just presented, which is why, with the Secretary's permission, I'd like to recognize another act of valor that has remained unacknowledged for too long. Secretary Harrington nodded, stepping back as another officer approached, carrying a different case. "During Operation Desert Storm," John continued, "our team was tasked with a reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines. Intelligence was critical to the ground offensive, and our findings would determine the path of advance for an entire division." The crowd listened in rapt silence as John recounted the mission, how they had infiltrated deep into Iraqi territory, gathering crucial information on enemy positions and strength. "We were compromised during extraction," John explained, "heavily outnumbered, with 2 team members critically wounded. Sergeant Miller, despite being injured himself, held off the enemy force while I called in our coordinates for emergency evacuation." John's voice remained steady, but Sarah could see the emotion in his eyes. The helicopter couldn't land due to enemy fire. Sergeant Miller created a diversion, drawing fire away from the landing zone at great personal risk. He was hit 3 times, but continued fighting until every member of our team was safely aboard. Catherine's grip tightened further, her knuckles white. This was a story she had never heard, details of her husband's service that had remained classified until this moment. "Tom Miller's actions that day saved 8 lives, including mine," John said. "He was recommended for the Silver Star, but due to the classified nature of our mission, the recognition was never formalized." The officer stepped forward, opening the case to reveal a Silver Star medal gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Today, that oversight is corrected," John announced. "It is my profound honor to present the Silver Star, posthumously awarded to Sergeant Thomas Miller for gallantry in action against enemies of the United States." Catherine rose shakily to her feet, Sarah supporting her as they approached the IBA stage. The crowd stood in respectful silence as John presented the medal to Catherine. "Tom would say he was just doing his job," Catherine said softly, accepting the award. "The best of us always do," John replied, equally quiet. The moment between them spoke of shared history and mutual understanding. Then, to everyone's surprise, John removed the Medal of Honor from around his neck, the original medal he had carried privately for decades. "Catherine, Tom, and I made a pact," he said, his voice now carrying across the hushed square. "If anything, happened to either of us, the survivor would ensure the other's family knew the full truth of our service. I've carried this medal all these years, waiting for the day I could fulfill that promise properly." He placed the medal in Catherine's hands alongside the silver star. "This belongs with Tom's family," John said. "It was as much his as mine." The gesture, unplanned and unexpected, moved even the military officials present. Secretary Harrington nodded in solemn approval. Sarah watched her mother carefully accept both medals, the weight of their significance far greater than their physical presence. The Marine Band began playing softly as Catherine and Sarah returned to their seats. The entire town of Millfield now understanding the caliber of the man who had once lived among them. From her seat, Sarah noticed movement at the edge of the crowd. Nellie Patterson stood frozen, her face ashen as the full impact of her earlier behavior sank in. She had turned away a Medal of Honor recipient, a man who had saved the life of Thomas Miller, one of Millfield's own heroes. Mayor Wilson approached the microphone next, visibly emotional. "On behalf of Millfield, I extend our deepest gratitude to Colonel Mercer and to the Miller family," he said. "Today we are reminded of the service and sacrifice that secure our freedoms." He turned to face John directly. "Colonel Mercer, Millfield failed to recognize you this morning. That failure is our shame. But if you'll permit us, we would be honored to recognize you properly now, not just as a decorated officer, but as a friend of our community and protector of one of our sons." The mayor gestured to the Veterans Memorial Stone. "We would be privileged to add a special marker acknowledging your connection to Millfield through Sergeant Miller, ensuring that future generations understand the bond between brothers in arms that transcends time and place." John nodded once, accepting the gesture with characteristic dignity. As the formal ceremony transitioned to a reception, townspeople approached John with reverence and gratitude, many apologizing for not recognizing him earlier. Through it all, John maintained the same quiet composure he had shown when being turned away from the diner, neither seeking nor expecting special treatment. As the formal ceremony concluded, the military precision gave way to a more relaxed community gathering. Tables with refreshments appeared, courtesy of the Army's logistics team, who seemed prepared for every contingency. Local residents mingled with uniformed personnel, the earlier divisions forgotten in the shared moment of pride and reflection. Secretary Harrington had been called away for an urgent video conference, but promised to return for the evening's formals. Dinner at the Millfield Community Center, a hastily arranged affair that had the town's volunteer committee in a frenzy of preparation. Sarah stood beside her mother, watching as John spoke with a group of veterans who had emerged from the woodwork, men who had served at Fort Garrison decades ago, now gray-haired, but standing straighter than they had in years, invigorated by the recognition of one of their own. "He hasn't changed," Catherine said quietly. "Still carrying everyone else's burdens." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. Catherine's gaze remained on John. "Your father told me once that John volunteered for the most dangerous assignments to protect those with families. He never married, never had children. The mission was his life." A young lieutenant approached them, respectfully addressing Catherine. "Mrs. Miller, Colonel Mercer asked if you and your daughter would join him. There's something he'd like to share with you privately." They followed the officer to a small room in the town hall that had been temporarily secured for VIPs. John waited inside, along with an older man in uniform whom Sarah didn't recognize. "Catherine, Sarah," John greeted them. "This is General Blackwood, my former commanding officer." The general shook their hands with solemn respect. "Mrs. Miller, Ms. Miller, your husband and father was an exceptional soldier and an even better man." "Thank you, sir," Catherine replied automatically, military courtesy ingrained through years as an Army wife. John gestured to the chairs. "There's more to the story that couldn't be shared publicly. With the declassification, I can finally tell you everything Tom wanted you to know." As they sat, John remained standing, his posture reflecting the weight of what he was about to share. After Desert Storm, Tom and I continued to serve on classified missions, he began. In 1997, we were deployed to a location I still can't name. The operation went badly. We were compromised, captured, and held for 6 weeks. Catherine's face paled. He never told me. He couldn't, John said gently. After our extraction, we were debriefed extensively. The Pentagon determined that all details would remain classified indefinitely. General Blackwood interjected. The geopolitical implications were too sensitive. Both John and Tom agreed to the terms. John continued. During our captivity, Tom sustained injuries that never fully healed. The chronic pain he experienced in later years, what the VA diagnosed as degenerative disc disease, was from torture, Catherine finished, comprehension dawning in her eyes. He always said it was from an old training injury. John nodded. He didn't want you to know the truth, to carry that burden. But he made me promise that if the mission was ever declassified, I would tell you what really happened. Sarah felt tears welling up. Her father had suffered for years before cancer claimed him, the pain evident despite his efforts to hide it. Now, the mystery of its origin was finally revealed. During our captivity, they tried to break us for information, John said, his voice steady despite the difficult subject. Tom endured more than anyone should have to. He never broke, never compromised our team or mission, General Blackwood added. Sergeant Miller was recommended for another decoration based on his conduct during captivity. Again, classification prevented formal recognition. John reached into his pocket, producing a small box. This was authorized last month when the operation was finally declassified. He opened it to reveal a Purple Heart. For wounds received in Bunchynan's action, John explained unnecessarily. Catherine accepted the box with trembling hands. 3 medals in one day after all these years. There's one more thing, John said. Tom made a video statement before his final deployment to be shared with you if the missions were ever declassified. It's been in secure storage until now. General Blackwood handed Catherine a flash drive. Mrs. Miller, this contains your husband's personal testimony. I've reviewed it as required by protocol, but otherwise, his words are private, meant for you and your daughter. Sarah watched her mother clutch the small device as if it were the most precious object in the world. A final message from her husband, hidden away for decades. He was so much more than anyone knew, Catherine whispered. The best of us often are, John replied quietly. Through the window, Sarah could see the town square still bustling with activity. The people of Millfield were experiencing a renewed sense of pride, their small community suddenly connected to acts of extraordinary courage that had shaped world events from the shadows. There's one more piece to this story, John said after a moment. Something Tom did that changed countless lives, including mine. He nodded to General Blackwood, who opened a laptop and pulled up a file. After our rescue and recovery, Tom developed a program for veterans suffering from PTSD and trauma, John explained. He called it Fortress Within. The military adopted it formally in 2002, and it's been helping service members ever since. The general turned the screen to show them statistics and testimonials. Over 20,000 veterans have completed the program, he said. Studies indicate a significant reduction in suicide rates among participants. Your husband's legacy extends far beyond his combat service. Sarah stared at the screen in disbelief. Her father had never mentioned creating such a program. His quiet work at the VA after retirement had seemed routine, not groundbreaking. He never told us, she said. John smiled sadly. Tom never wanted recognition. He just wanted to help those who were suffering as we had suffered. Outside, the sound of helicopters signaled the arrival of more dignitaries for the evening's formal dinner. Millfield's moment in the national spotlight was just a beginning. The Millfield Community Center had been transformed in a matter of hours. Military efficiency combined with local enthusiasm had produced an elegant venue for the evening's formal dinner. White tablecloths covered utilitarian folding tables, and borrowed centerpieces from the garden club added unexpected elegance. Sarah and Catherine had gone home briefly to change into more appropriate attire before returning to find the town unrecognizable. Streets lined with official vehicles, security checkpoints at major intersections, and a general atmosphere of excitement unlike anything Millfield had experienced in decades. As they entered the community center, Sarah spotted Nellie Patterson standing awkwardly near the entrance, dressed in what was clearly her Sunday best. Their eyes met, and Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions, resentment at how Nellie had treated John, but also understanding of the woman's evident discomfort. "I should speak with her," Sarah said to her mother. Catherine followed her gaze. "Be kind. We all make mistakes." Sarah approached Nellie, who seemed to shrink slightly at her advance. "Miss Patterson," Sarah greeted her, keeping her tone neutral. "Sarah," Nellie replied, her usual brusque manner replaced by uncertainty. I don't know what to say." "You could start with hello to Colonel Mercer," Sarah suggested. Nellie's face flushed. "I've been trying to work up the courage. What I did this morning was inexcusable." Before Sarah could respond, John himself appeared beside them, now dressed in his formal Army uniform, medals properly displayed across his chest. "Ms. Patterson," he said, extending his hand. "I believe we met earlier under less formal circumstances." Nellie looked mortified, her hand trembling as she took his. "Colonel Mercer, I am so deeply sorry for how I treated you. I had no idea that I was a decorated officer," John finished gently. "You couldn't have known, and truthfully, it shouldn't matter." His words, intended to ease her discomfort, seemed to distress Nellie further. "That's just it," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "It shouldn't matter. My Robert, my late husband, he served in Vietnam, came home to people spitting on his uniform. He always said you should treat every veteran with respect because you never know what they've sacrificed." Tears welled in her eyes. "And here I am, doing exactly what he despised. I've become what he hated most." John's expression softened. "We all fall short of our ideals sometimes, Ms. Patterson. Please," she said, "call me Nellie." "Nellie," he acknowledged. "Your husband sounds like a wise man." "He was," she replied. "After he died, I just hardened. The diner was our dream, not just mine. Keeping it going meant becoming tougher, more rigid." Sarah listened, seeing her difficult employer in a new light. The bitterness had a source, the harshness a history. "Robert would be ashamed of me today," Nellie continued. "I'm ashamed," John considered her words. "Shame isn't productive unless it leads to change." The conversation was interrupted by Mayor Wilson, who approached with a local reporter and photographer in tow. "Colonel Mercer, Ms. Patterson." "Just the people I wanted to see together," he exclaimed, oblivious to the tension. "The Millfield Gazette wants a photo of our distinguished guest with local business owners." Before anyone could object, the photographer was positioning them, John standing uncomfortably beside a mortified Nellie. "Perhaps another time," John suggested diplomatically. The mayor, sensing the awkwardness but misinterpreting its cause, leaned in. "Nellie, this is a great opportunity for the diner. Colonel Mercer is a national hero." Nellie straightened suddenly. "No, Mayor Wilson, I don't deserve to be in this photo." She turned to the reporter. "If you want a real story, write about how I turned away a Medal of Honor recipient from my diner this morning because I judged him by his appearance." A shocked silence followed her confession. "That's not necessary, Miss Patterson," John said quietly. "It is," she insisted. "Accountability matters. I failed to live up to my husband's values, and I need to own that." The reporter, sensing a more compelling angle than the planned puff piece, began taking notes. "Miss Patterson, would you be willing to elaborate on that statement?" Mayor Wilson looked horrified, clearly envisioning the negative publicity for Millfield, but Nellie stood firm. "I would," she said. "Sometimes the most patriotic thing we can do is acknowledge when we've failed to honor those who served." John watched her with newfound respect. That takes courage. Sarah, witnessing the exchange, was torn between satisfaction at Nellie's accountability and concern for the woman's reputation. The diner was her livelihood, after all. "Perhaps," Sarah suggested, The story could be about redemption rather than failure, about how Millfield is learning to better honor its veterans, starting today. The reporter considered this. A community's journey to reconnect with its military heritage. I like it. Nellie looked at Sarah gratefully, then turned to John. Colonel Mercer, I know I have no right to ask, but would you consider giving the diner, a second chance? I'd be honored if you would dine with us properly before you leave town. John smiled. I hear the apple pie is worth a visit. For the first time that day, Nellie laughed, the sound breaking through her usual stern demeanor. Robert's recipe. Some say it's the best in 3 counties. Then how could I refuse? John replied. As they spoke, more guests arrived, including several high-ranking military officials and politicians drawn by the increasingly high-profile nature of the event. What had begun as a simple declassification ceremony was evolving into something more significant, a moment of national reflection on how America honors its heroes, both publicly and privately. Sarah watched as John was pulled away for introductions, his natural dignity evident even among the power brokers now filling the room. He belonged in this world of respect and recognition, yet he had accepted his earlier rejection with the same grace he now accepted adulation. The lesson wasn't lost on Millfield's residents, who moved through the gathering with newfound awareness of appearances versus reality, and the silent heroes who might walk among them unrecognized. The formal dinner proceeded with military precision, each speaker carefully timed, each honor bestowed with appropriate gravity. As coffee and dessert were served, the official program concluded, allowing guests to mingle more freely. John found himself momentarily alone at his table, a rare quiet moment in the whirlwind day. Sarah approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, she said, sliding one toward him. You've been talking for hours. Thank you, he replied, gratitude evident in his tired eyes. You're very much like your father, noticing what others need. Sarah sat beside him, seizing the opportunity for a more personal conversation. Can I ask you something? About the medal. John nodded, his hand moving automatically to where the Medal of Honor had hung around his neck for decades, now replaced by the formal ribbon and medal on his uniform. Why did you carry it that way, hidden, but always with you? John considered the question, taking a sip of coffee before answering. After it was presented, I couldn't bring myself to display it, he began. It felt wrong, somehow. Men died on that mission. Better men than me. I doubt that, Sarah said softly. John smiled faintly. Your father would have said the same thing. But it's true. The team we lost in Panama, Martinez, Wilcox, and Chen, they had families waiting for them, dreams beyond the uniform. I was, just a soldier. Nothing more, nothing less. He traced the edge of his coffee cup lost in memory. After the ceremony at the Pentagon, I put the medal in a drawer, couldn't look at it. Then your father came to see me in the hospital after we were rescued from captivity. The mission you told us about earlier, Sarah confirmed. John nodded. I was in a dark place, questioning everything. Tom brought the medal with him, said if I couldn't wear it for myself, I should wear it for Martinez, Wilcox, and Chen. For everyone who didn't come home. Sarah could picture her father saying exactly that, practical and deeply compassionate beneath his military bearing. So, I started carrying it, John continued, not displayed but present, a reminder of what we owe to those who sacrificed everything. He looked across the room to where Catherine sat in conversation with General Blackwood, the two of them sharing memories of a man they had both deeply respected. Your father understood burden better than anyone I've ever known, John said. After our captivity, while I was still struggling with what we'd endured, he was already developing ways to help others. That program I told you about, Fortress. Within, he created it while still in physical therapy himself. Sarah shook her head in wonder. He never talked about any of this. Tom believed actions mattered more than recognition, John replied. One night, after a particularly rough therapy session, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "Medals don't make the man, John. What you do when nobody's watching, that's what defines you. Sarah felt tears threatening. It sounded exactly like something her father would say. John continued, his voice reflective. The medal became a private commitment, a daily reminder to live up to the ideals it represents, even when, especially when, no one was watching. Around them, the celebration continued, but in their corner, time seemed suspended in remembrance. There were missions after Panama, John said, operations I still can't discuss. Your father saved my life more times than I could count, not just physically, but in every way that matters. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a worn photograph, carefully preserved in plastic. It showed a group of soldiers in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, dusty and exhausted, but smiling. Your dad's the one in the middle, John said, passing it to Sarah. She studied the image, recognizing her father instantly, despite his youth. He stood at the center of the group, his posture confident, his smile genuine. Beside him stood a younger John Mercer, more serious, but with the same steady presence he carried now. We lost Ramirez 2 days after this was taken, John said, pointing to a smiling soldier at the end of the row. Benson made it home, but took his own life in 2005. His finger moved to another face. Your father helped establish a support network for veterans after that, determined to prevent more losses. Sarah handed the photograph back carefully, understanding now why John had worn the medal as he did, not hidden out of shame, but carried close to his heart as a connection to the brothers he had lost and the values they represented. The medal they gave me today will go in a display case somewhere, John said. But this, he touched his chest where the original had hung, this one belongs with your family now. It was as much your father's as mine. A commotion near the entrance drew their attention as new guests arrived. A group of veterans from the nearby VA hospital, many in wheelchairs, some with visible injuries or prosthetics. They had come to honor one of their own. John straightened, instantly alert. Excuse me, Sarah, I need to greet them. She watched as he crossed the room, his fatigue seemingly forgotten, as he welcomed each veteran personally, bending to speak at eye level with those in wheelchairs, clasping hands with genuine connection. The medal had shaped him, Sarah realized, but not in the way most might expect. Its weight had not been one of glory, but of responsibility, a daily reminder of the duty owed to the fallen and to those still carrying the invisible wounds of service. By the following morning, Millfield had changed. Military vehicles still lined Main Street. A press corps had established a makeshift headquarters in the motel parking lot, and flags appeared on porches that had been bare for years. The story had broken nationally overnight, not just of John's declassified heroism, but of Millfield's initial rejection and subsequent embrace of the decorated veteran. Cable news vans had arrived before dawn, and reporters prowled the streets, seeking locals willing to offer sound bites about their small town's sudden prominence. Sarah arrived at Nellie's Diner for her morning shift to find a line extending. Down the block, not regular customers, but visitors hoping to see the establishment that had turned away a Medal of Honor recipient. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others to express indignation, a few simply because the diner had become an overnight landmark. Inside, Nellie moved with frantic energy, her usual composure fractured by the unprecedented demand and the weight of public scrutiny. "We're doing the best we can," she snapped at a customer who complained about the wait time. "Either be patient or leave." Sarah tied on her apron quickly. "I've got tables 4 through 8, she said, diving into the chaos. By mid-morning, Mayor Wilson called an emergency town meeting at the community center. With John scheduled to visit local schools before departing that evening, the mayor hoped to address the growing tensions and establish a unified message for the increasingly aggressive media. "We need to present Millfield in the best possible light," he urged the hastily assembled group of business owners and community leaders. "This is an opportunity to put our town on the map in a positive way." Carl from the hardware store stood up. "Seems to me we're already on the map for turning." Away a war hero. Not much positive about that. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. That was one business, not the entire town, the mayor countered. But none of us recognized him either, Frank the postmaster pointed out. We've all walked past veterans, without a second glance. Nellie's just taking the heat for what any of us might have done. The gathering grew more heated as factions formed, those defending Nellie, those condemning her actions, and those concerned primarily with the town's image. The colonel himself has forgiven Nellie, Sarah interjected, trying to redirect the conversation. Shouldn't that count for something? Easy for him to be magnanimous when he's got medals and national attention, retorted Linda, from the flower shop. Nellie's business might never recover from this. Just then, the community center doors opened and several older men entered, local veterans who rarely participated in town affairs, preferring to keep to themselves. Their unofficial leader, Bill Henderson, had served in Vietnam and suffered from PTSD that kept him largely isolated. We've been listening to you all argue about image and reputation, Bill said, his voice rough from disuse. But you're missing the point entirely. The room fell silent, acknowledging the moral authority these men carried in the current context. This isn't about Nellie or Millfield's reputation, Bill continued. It's about how we've forgotten what matters. When Fort Garrison closed, this town turned its back on its military heritage. We stopped having parades. The memorial in the square gathered dust. Young folks left for opportunities elsewhere, and those of us who served became invisible. He looked around the room, making eye contact with several people who glanced away, uncomfortable with his direct gaze. Colonel Mercer didn't come here for recognition, Bill said firmly. He came to honor Thomas Miller, one of our own who served quietly and died without fanfare. The real shame isn't what happened at the diner, it's that none of us knew Tom Miller's full story until a stranger came to tell it. The room absorbed his words, the earlier divisiveness giving way to collective reflection. Mayor Wilson, sensing the shift, cleared his throat. What do you suggest, Bill? Stop worrying about the media circus, Bill replied. Focus on what matters, honoring service and sacrifice, not just today while the cameras are here, but every day moving forward. Another veteran stood up, Jake Simmons, who owned the gas station on the edge of town. Some of us have been trying to raise funds for years to expand the memorial, add names for more recent conflicts. The council always said there wasn't enough interest or budget. The mayor had the grace to look embarrassed. Perhaps we could revisit that proposal. We need to do more than add names to a stone, Sarah said, finding her voice. My father created a program to help veterans with PTSD and trauma. What if Millfield became a place where that program was available to any veteran who needed it? Bill Henderson's eyes widened slightly. Your father developed Fortress Within? I went through that program at the VA in Cleveland. Changed my life, Sarah nodded, emotion tightening her throat. I just found out yesterday. Dad never talked about it. Typical Tom, Bill said with a sad smile, always helping without needing. Credit. A renewed sense of purpose seemed to sweep through the room. The earlier factions dissolved as people began discussing practical ways to honor Millfield's military connections, not just for the cameras, but for the community's future. Outside, the media crews continued their coverage, unaware that inside the community center, a transformation was underway that would change Millfield far more fundamentally than a single day of national attention ever could. As the meeting concluded, Sarah slipped out early to return to the diner. The crowd had thinned somewhat, but Nellie still moved with tense efficiency, her face drawn with fatigue and stress. How was the meeting? She asked when she spotted Sarah. Productive, Sarah replied. I think Millfield might finally be remembering who it used to be. Nellie nodded, understanding in her tired eyes. Sometimes it takes losing your way to remember what matters. The lunch rush had finally subsided, leaving Nellie's diner in relative calm for the first time that day. Sarah wiped down tables while Nellie sat heavily in a booth, counting the morning's receipts, significantly higher than normal, though the cost in stress and public scrutiny had been substantial. Take a break, Sarah, Nellie said, gesturing to the seat across from her. You've been running since you got here? Sarah slid into the booth, surprised by the invitation. In her 3 months at the diner, Nellie had never suggested they sit together. "I've been thinking about what you said," Nellie began, setting aside the cash she'd been counting. "About your father's program for veterans." "Fortress Within," Sarah supplied. "Yes, I'd like to learn more about it." Nellie's voice held an unfamiliar vulnerability. "For personal reasons." Sarah waited, sensing there was more to come. Nellie looked down at her hands, strong, capable hands that had run the diner without faltering for 7 years since Robert's death. "My husband didn't just serve in Vietnam. He came back different." "PTSD?" Sarah asked gently. Nellie nodded. "They didn't call it that then. No diagnosis, no treatment. Just nightmares and anger, and a man trying to outrun memories he couldn't escape." She glanced around the diner, her domain, her life's work. This place saved him in a way, gave him purpose, structure, something to focus on besides what he'd seen and done. Sarah thought of her own father, how his work at the VA had seemed like a simple job, but had apparently been his way of processing his own experiences while helping others. "Robert never talked about Vietnam," Nellie continued, "not once in 40 years of marriage, but I lived with its effects every day." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, understanding blooming. "That must have been difficult." "He was a good man," Nellie insisted. "The war took pieces of him, but what remained was solid gold." Her voice caught slightly. "When he died, I think I blamed the military somehow, for sending him to Vietnam, for changing him, for the health problems that eventually took him." The confession hung between them, revealing layers to Nellie that Sarah had never suspected. "Is that why you reacted as you did to John?" Sarah asked carefully. Nellie's shoulders slumped slightly. "Maybe, not consciously. But seeing someone in worn clothes who'd clearly seen hard times, it reminded me of how Robert might have ended up without me." She straightened, her moment of vulnerability passing. "That's no excuse. I judged Colonel Mercer unfairly, and I'm ashamed of that." "You're not alone," Sarah assured her. "My dad used to say that civilians can never truly understand what veterans carry. The best we can do is try to listen and learn." Nellie nodded, then reached into her purse and withdrew an old photograph, sliding it across the table. It showed a handsome young man in uniform, his expression serious but kind. "Robert in 1968, before his second tour," Nellie explained. He was 23. Sarah studied the image, seeing echoes of the older man she vaguely remembered from childhood visits to the diner. "He has kind eyes." "Yes," Nellie agreed softly. "He did." A customer entered, the bell above the door breaking the moment. Nellie tucked the photograph away and stood, professional demeanor, returning instantly. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself watching Nellie with new understanding. The brusque efficiency, the rigid standards, the resistance to change, all of it made sense now as the protective shell of someone who had spent decades supporting a wounded warrior, only to lose him despite her best efforts. Near closing time, as Sarah refilled the sugar dispensers, the bell jingled again. She looked up to see John Mercer entering, now dressed in civilian clothes, though still carrying himself with military bearing. "Colonel," Nellie said, emerging from the kitchen, "you came." "I promised I would," he replied simply, "and I hear the apple pie is not to be missed." The diner was empty except for the three of them, the usual closing time already passed. Nellie gestured to a booth, the best one, with a view of the town square. "Coffee and pie are on the house," she said. "It's the least I can do." John sat down, his movements betraying fatigue from the day's activities. "Actually, I was hoping both of you might join me. There's something I'd like to discuss." Sarah and Nellie exchanged glances. Then Nellie nodded. "Let me get that pie first." She disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with 3 slices of her famous apple pie and a pot of fresh coffee. As they settled into the booth, John took a bite of pie and nodded appreciatively. "This lives up to its reputation." "Robert's recipe," Nellie said. "He was the baker in the family." John studied her for a moment. "Vietnam?" Nellie looked startled, then nodded. "How did you know?" The photograph on the wall, John said, gesturing to a framed picture behind the counter. Robert, in his later years, standing proudly in front of the diner. The way he holds himself. Once you've been in combat, you recognize it in others. Nellie's eyes glistened with unexpected tears. 25th Infantry Division, 2 tours. John nodded respectfully. They saw heavy action. Yes, Nellie whispered, years of unspoken understanding passing between them in that single word. Sarah watched the exchange with a sense of witnessing something profound, a recognition between those who had loved warriors, who had seen the private battles fought long after the public wars ended. "Ms. Patterson," John said gently, "I recognize deflection when I see it. This morning wasn't really about my appearance, was it?" Nellie's composure wavered. "No," she admitted. "It was about my own unresolved grief. Seeing you, someone who served, who came back, it brought everything back." John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The hardest battles are often the ones fought at home after the war ends." "Robert fought that battle every day," Nellie said. "Sometimes I think I'm still fighting it for him." "That," John said quietly, "is its own kind of valor." The evening sun cast long shadows across Millfield's town square as residents gathered for an impromptu ceremony. Word had spread quickly after the town meeting. Before Colonel Mercer departed, the community wanted to properly acknowledge both his service and their connection through Thomas Miller. What had begun as a simple gathering grew as the hour approached. Veterans from surrounding communities arrived, many in uniform or wearing caps and jackets identifying their service. Local families brought children, explaining in hushed tones the significance of the medals and the importance of respect. Sarah stood with her mother near the Veterans Memorial, both women holding the medals John had given them the day before. Catherine with the Silver Star, awarded posthumously to her husband. Sarah with the Medal of Honor John had carried for decades. "Mom," Sarah whispered, "are you sure about this? This medal means so much to him." Catherine nodded firmly. "John and your father had an understanding deeper than we can imagine. If John wants the medal to stay with us, we honor that wish." Merci. Wilson had arranged for a proper podium and sound system, determined that this hometown ceremony would be conducted with appropriate dignity, even if it lacked the grandeur of the official military event. Local media had been allowed discreet coverage, but national outlets were politely restricted to the perimeter. This moment belonged to Millfield. At precisely 6 o'clock, a color guard from the local VFW post presented the flag, followed by a surprisingly beautiful rendition of the national anthem sung by Mrs. Henderson, the music teacher from Millfield Elementary. John arrived alongside Bill Henderson and the other local veterans, all walking with a synchronized step that never quite leaves those who have served. He had changed again, now wearing a simple dark suit with only a small ribbon on his lapel, indicating his Medal of Honor status, modest yet unmistakable to those who recognized its significance. Mayor Wilson welcomed everyone briefly before turning the microphone over to Bill Henderson. "Millfield has always sent its sons and daughters to serve," Bill began, his voice steady despite his usual reluctance to speak publicly. "From the Revolutionary War through Afghanistan, our names appear on monuments across this nation. But somewhere along the way, we forgot to honor that legacy here at home." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Today we begin to correct that oversight," Bill continued, "not with grand gestures for the cameras, but with a renewed commitment to remember not just today, but every day." He gestured to John, inviting him forward. Colonel John Mercer could have received his long overdue recognition anywhere. He chose Millfield because of one man, Thomas Miller, and the bond they forged in service to our nation. John stepped to the microphone, his quiet authority immediately commanding attention. "Thomas Miller was the finest soldier I ever knew," he began simply. "But more importantly, he was the finest man I ever knew. When our mission was declassified, I had one request, that the recognition happen here, where Tom grew up, where his values were formed." He looked toward Catherine and Sarah. "Tom's legacy lives on in his family, but also in every veteran who has found healing through his Fortress Within program. What began as one man's effort to process his own trauma has helped thousands find their way back from the darkest places a warrior can go. Mayor Wilson stepped forward with a small plaque that would eventually be mounted on the Veterans Memorial. Colonel Mercer, on behalf of Millfield, we wish to acknowledge your service and your connection to our community through Sergeant Miller. John accepted the plaque with a respectful nod, and, the mayor continued, we are announcing today the establishment of the Thomas Miller Veterans Support Initiative, which will bring the Fortress Within program to Millfield, creating a place where veterans from across the region can find the support they need. Applause broke out, particularly strong among the visiting veterans who understood the significance of such a program in a rural area where mental health resources were scarce. Catherine stepped forward, still holding the Silver Star. In honor of this initiative, our family would like to donate Tom's medals to be displayed here, alongside the stories of his service, so that future generations will understand the quiet heroism that often goes unrecognized. John nodded his approval, emotion evident in his eyes despite his composed expression. As the formal ceremony concluded, something unexpected happened. Nellie Patterson approached the microphone, visibly nervous but determined. I'd like to add something, if I may, she said, her voice wavering slightly before finding strength. My husband Robert served in Vietnam. He came home with wounds no one could see and fought battles no one knew about. In his memory, I'd like to announce that, starting tomorrow, Nellie's Diner will be Patterson's family restaurant again, as it was when he was alive. She took a deep breath before continuing. And every day we'll reserve a table for veterans. No veteran in Millfield will ever be turned away again, regardless of appearance or circumstance. A respectful hush fell over the crowd, this simple gesture resonating deeply with everyone present. Additionally, Nellie continued, all proceeds from our apple pie, Robert's special recipe, will support the Thomas Miller Veterans Support Initiative. As she stepped back, spontaneous applause erupted. Sarah caught John's eye across the crowd, seeing in his expression a complex mix of emotions, satisfaction, remembrance, and a quiet pride not in his own recognition, but in witnessing a community reclaiming its better self. The formal ceremony transitioned to a more relaxed gathering as the sun set over Millfield. Residents approached John to shake his hand or simply thank him, not just for his service, but for bringing Thomas Miller's story back to his hometown. Children gazed at the medals with wide-eyed wonder as parents explained their significance in hushed, reverent tones. The veterans mingled with civilians, some sharing stories they had kept silent for decades, finding, in this moment, a new willingness to connect. And through it all, John moved with quiet dignity, deflecting personal praise to focus on the greater purpose that had brought him to Millfield, honoring a brother in arms and ensuring that his legacy would continue to heal wounded warriors for generations to come. 6 weeks after Colonel John Mercer's visit, Patterson's family restaurant hummed with morning activity. The transformation had been swift but meaningful, not just the return to its original name, but a shift in atmosphere that regulars immediately noticed and newcomers instinctively felt. Sarah arranged silverware on the veterans' table, a booth near the window that remained reserved regardless of how busy the diner became. A small sign identified it simply, "For those who served." Above it hung 2 shadow boxes, one containing Robert Patterson's service medals and photograph, the other temporarily empty but labeled "In honor of Thomas Miller," with a note explaining that his medals would be displayed once the formal mounting was complete. "Coffee's fresh," Nellie called from behind the counter, her tone brisk but lacking the edge that had once characterized it. She wore her hair differently now, softer around her face, and had replaced her utilitarian uniform with a dress reminiscent of the one she'd worn in old photos with Robert. The bell above the door jingled as Bill Henderson entered, followed by 2 other local veterans who had become regular morning customers. They nodded to Sarah and settled at their usual table, not the veterans' booth, which they insisted should remain available for those passing through who might need it more. "Usual, gentlemen?" Sarah asked, coffee pot already in hand. "Please," Bill replied, then gestured to the wall beside their table. "New edition looks good." Sarah followed his gaze to the freshly hung bulletin board covered with information about veterans' resources, everything from VA benefits to the newly established Millfield chapter of Fortress Within, which would hold its first meeting the following week in the community center. "Mom's been working with the VA in Cleveland to get it set up properly," Sarah explained, pouring their coffee. "They're sending a trained facilitator for the first few sessions until our local volunteers are certified. Your father would be proud," Bill said simply. The comment warmed Sarah as she moved to greet new customers. In the weeks since learning about her father's work, she had begun the process of applying to nursing school with a new sense of purpose, not just a career, but a calling connected to his legacy. Nellie emerged from the kitchen carrying plates of eggs and hash browns. As she served Bill's table, Sarah noticed her lingering to chat, something the old Nellie would never have done during the busy breakfast rush. "How's Jake doing with the new medication?" Nellie asked Bill quietly, referring to another veteran who had recently started treatment for PTSD. "Better," Bill replied. "Still having nightmares, but the panic attacks are less frequent." Nellie nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Tell him the offer stands. Kitchen work, flexible hours, no questions asked on the hard days." Since reopening as Patterson's, Nellie had hired 2 veterans part-time, working around their VA appointments and challenging days with a patients her staff had never seen before. The diner's reputation had spread beyond Millfield, becoming known as a place where veterans could find not just a meal, but understanding. The morning progressed with comfortable routine until Mayor Wilson arrived carrying a large envelope and looking uncharacteristically solemn. "Morning, Mayor," Sarah greeted him. "Coffee?" "Please," he replied, settling at the counter. "Is Nellie available? I have something for her." Sarah gestured toward the kitchen, where Nellie was visible through the service window, kneading dough for the day's pies. "I'll get her," Sarah offered. But just then, Nellie looked up, noticed the mayor, and wiped her hands on her apron before emerging. "Mayor Wilson," she acknowledged. "What brings you in so early?" The mayor slid the envelope across the counter. "This arrived at the town hall yesterday. Addressed to Patterson's Family Restaurant, care of the mayor. Military courier delivered it personally." Nellie's flour-dusted hands hesitated above the envelope. "From Colonel Mercer?" "I believe so," the mayor confirmed. The diner had quieted, regulars aware that something significant was happening. Nellie carefully opened the envelope and withdrew several items: a handwritten letter, a photograph, and what appeared to be official military documents. She read the letter silently, her expression shifting from curiosity to profound emotion. When she finished, she handed it to Sarah without speaking. Sarah began reading aloud, sensing that Nellie wanted the content shared. "Dear Nellie, I hope this letter finds you well and Patterson's Family Restaurant thriving as Robert intended. My brief time in Millfield has stayed with me, particularly our conversation behind the memorial. Enclosed, you'll find documentation of Robert's service that may answer questions he couldn't discuss. His unit was involved in classified operations similar to those Tom and I conducted years later. The records have recently been declassified, revealing acts of courage that went unrecognized at the time. I have submitted a formal recommendation that Robert be considered for the Bronze Star for his actions during Operation Switchback. The supporting documentation is included should you wish to review it. The Pentagon has indicated the recommendation will likely be approved given the newly available evidence. Also enclosed is a photograph Tom kept, one I didn't know existed until Catherine shared his personal effects with me. It shows Tom, myself, and Robert at Fort Garrison in 1987. I believe they knew each other, though neither mentioned it to me directly. Military paths often cross in unexpected ways. The final item is a challenge coin from my old unit. Traditionally, these are carried by members as symbols of belonging and mutual support. Robert should have received one, but many were never distributed due to the classified nature of their operations. This one belongs with him. Millfield reminded me that healing happens in community, not isolation. I'm grateful for the lesson. With respect and appreciation, John Mercer. Sarah looked up from the letter to find Nellie holding the challenge coin, her fingers tracing its embossed surface with reverence. He knew, Nellie whispered. Robert knew Thomas Miller. The photograph showed 3 young men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, Robert on the left, John in the middle, Thomas on the right. Despite the years separating the image from the present, the connection between them was unmistakable. Mom needs to see this, Sarah said softly. Nellie nodded, carefully returning the items to the envelope, except for the photograph, which she immediately took to an empty space on the wall near Robert's shadow box. This goes here, she said decisively, where everyone can see that Millfield's heroes knew each other, that they were connected long before we understood. As she secured the photograph to the wall, the veterans in the diner rose in silent respect, recognizing the significance of the moment. The circle had closed somehow, past connected to present, individual stories woven into a shared narrative of service, sacrifice, and finally, recognition. 1 year later, Millfield had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The Veterans Memorial in the town square now included a new wing with interactive displays telling the stories of local service members from all eras. Thomas Miller's and Robert Patterson's photographs held prominent positions, their service records and decorations displayed with dignity and respect. Sarah parked her car behind Patterson's family restaurant, smiling at the Veterans Welcome sign that had become something of a local landmark. The diner itself had expanded, taking over the vacant storefront next door to create a community space where the Fortress Within program now held regular meetings. Inside, the morning rush was in full swing. Sarah waved to Nellie, who orchestrated the busy kitchen with calm efficiency, a far cry from the tense manager of a year ago. The veterans' table was occupied by 3 young soldiers passing through on leave, enjoying the famous apple pie for breakfast because, as Nellie always said, life's uncertain, eat dessert first. Sarah slipped into the back office where her mother sat reviewing applications for the Thomas Miller Scholarship Fund, which supported veterans pursuing healthcare careers. The fund had begun modestly with proceeds from Patterson's apple pie sales, but had grown significantly after a feature story in a national magazine brought attention to Millfield's transformation. How many this year? Sarah asked, peering over her mother's shoulder. 23, Catherine replied. Quality candidates too. The selection committee is going to have a difficult choice. Sarah nodded, thinking of her own journey over the past year. She was halfway through her nursing program now, commuting to classes while continuing to work part-time at the diner. The hands-on experience with veterans had shaped her focus. Trauma-informed care for those with PTSD and related conditions. Any word from John? Catherine asked, setting aside the applications. A postcard last month, Sarah replied. Still, in Montana, still enjoying the silence, as he puts it. Though John Mercer had left Millfield the morning after the ceremony, his influence remained. Occasional communications arrived, brief but meaningful updates, resources for the Fortress Within program, and once, a surprise visit when he was passing through on his way to Washington for a meeting at the Pentagon. The Mercer-Miller Day Committee wants to finalize plans for this year's observance, Catherine said, referring to the annual event that had grown from the impromptu ceremony of the previous year. They're hoping for a video message from John, since he's declined to attend in person. Sarah smiled, knowing John's discomfort with public attention. I'll email him, but no promises. You know how he feels about spotlights. The bell above the diner door jingled as Mayor Wilson entered, with a small entourage of visitors in business attire. Nellie greeted them warmly, gesturing toward the community room where tables had been arranged for a meeting. The economic development, Council, Catherine explained, noticing Sarah's curious expression. They're meeting with representatives from the VA about expanding services in Millfield. The Veterans Outreach Program has put us on the map. Indeed, it had. What began as a small town's attempt to honor its military connections had evolved into a model program that drew visitors from across the state. The Fortress, within chapter, had grown to serve veterans from 3 counties, and Patterson's had inspired similar veteran-friendly establishments in neighboring communities. Sarah glanced at her watch. I should get going. Clinical rotations start at noon. Before you go, Catherine said, reaching into her desk drawer, this came for you yesterday. She handed Sarah a small package bearing a Montana postmark. Inside was a handwritten note from John and a battered paperback book titled Medic's Guide to Combat Trauma, with Thomas Miller's name written inside the cover. The note read, Sarah found. This while organizing Tom's things. Catherine thought you should have it for your studies. Your father wrote the margin notes during his time as a field medic. His insights might help you understand what veterans experience. Proud of the path you've chosen. John Sarah ran her fingers over her father's neat handwriting in the margins, feeling a connection across time and distance. The book represented another piece of the puzzle, another aspect of Thomas Miller's service that was only now being revealed. The door to the office opened, and Bill Henderson appeared. Sarah thought you'd want to know. Jake Simmons just got approved for that VA housing assistance. He'll be able to keep his place. That's wonderful, Sarah replied, genuinely pleased. Jake had struggled with homelessness between bouts of PTSD, and the stability of secure housing was a crucial step in his recovery. Couldn't have done it without your help navigating the paperwork, Bill acknowledged. You've got your father's way with bureaucracy. The simple comparison warmed Sarah deeply. Over the past year, she had discovered dimensions of her father she'd never known in life. His courage, his compassion, his quiet determination to improve the lives of fellow veterans without seeking recognition. Outside, a bus pulled up in front of the diner, the weekly VA shuttle bringing veterans from rural areas to medical appointments in the city. As part of Millfield's new commitment, Patterson's provided free coffee and pastries to these travelers, and the community room offered a comfortable rest stop during the long journey. Sarah watched through the window as Nellie personally greeted each veteran, some in wheelchairs, others bearing less visible wounds. The woman who had once turned away John Mercer now embodied the spirit of welcome and respect that had transformed Millfield. Your father would be proud, Catherine said softly, following Sarah's gaze, not just of you, but of what his story has inspired. John, too, Sarah added. His decision to come here to honor Dad publicly, it changed everything. The legacy of that decision continued to unfold in ways neither of them could have anticipated. A small town rediscovering its heart, veterans finding community and understanding, and a new generation, led by Sarah, carrying forward the mission of healing and recognition that Thomas Miller had begun decades earlier. As Sarah prepared to leave for her clinical rotation, she tucked her father's book carefully into her bag, another piece of his legacy now guiding her own path of service.